Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. And so I'm going to sort of start off our conversation today. And Erin and I have structured today's talk in some sections, and we're going to start off with how did we arrive at abstraction. And I just want to say that when Kate and David suggested that Erin and I talk, I was just so excited because I feel like Erin and I have sort of been circling around each other in terms of our conversations around abstraction in particular. So I was just so excited to be able to talk with Erin and to prepare, because it's been just a really enlightening few weeks to be able to be in conversation with him, and we're going to kind of hopefully continue that today with one another. So I'm going to start off by answering this question: how did I arrive at abstraction? By starting a little bit early with the work that I have been making in grad school. So I'm going to start showing you some older works of mine, and this in particular is a very important early series to me, and it's an importance that has been unfurling and unraveling the longer that I've been working in photography. And because in particularly, one of the ways that I used photography was as a way of relating to the world. I also saw it as a means of protection. So I would often take my photographs, but knowing, as some of you guys who are familiar with my work know that I work in self-portraiture. Yeah. I rarely would find myself in front of the camera. And so what I'm showing here now are two pieces from an early series that I call Place Settings, that started with this very strong affinity of mine towards collecting Black plastic bags from the street, and particularly in the neighborhood that I lived at the time, which was in Harlem, in New York. So this was the time between my first and second year in graduate school, and I found myself in this neighborhood where I wasn't feeling quite at home and had expected to feel that way, and had begun to pick up these Black plastic bags as just sort of this this extreme, I call it an extreme need to do something that was inexplicable to me. So after collecting these bags for quite some time, I actually decided to ground them in photography, which again is a way that I just kind of related to the world. So if I didn't understand something, then I would place it inside of photography, because it's a medium that I know very well, and it's also a medium that I can control very well. So on the left-hand side, you'll see like a very shallow depth of field of these dishes that I wrapped up in the plastic. And on the right-hand side, it's from another treatment of these bags where I decided to fold them and sort of use them more sculpturally. But in the moment, I was just kind of trying to figure out why I was so obsessed with these pieces. This is a series of work that kind of followed my paper bag series, where here I've labeled it Vermont Studio Center. It's my first residency after graduate school. I'm still working with these bags, still figuring them out. And I began pairing them with self-portraits as overlays. So making combination photograms / I guess, traditional photographs where I would use an enlarger to project the negative of me, the self-portrait, through the overlay of the bags onto a photosensitive piece of paper. So just to kind of just make sure people know what photograms are. So photograms are essentially contact prints where you need a light sensitive substrate. And in this case, I was using paper, and you just place an object on top of it. So a traditional photogram would have been, for instance, this image here without the negative. It would have just been this overlay of the bags. But I'll say that on the right-hand side, I love this photo of me in the studio at the time, because it kind of shows an obsession wall with this process. And on the left-hand side, I'm making some markings, still trying to figure out again, how am I going to use these bags? Why do I feel a need to place them into my work so much? But after this, I actually stopped making photographs for a while, mostly after a slew of rejection letters and a slew of just applications just kind of coming to naught. I decided to just sort of stop taking photographs. And David alludes to this, but I'll say that my hums go back, they precede a lot of the work that I'm making now. And when I started making again, I started making these sound pieces that I now call hums. And what I was doing at the time was noticing a tick in my own anxiety from living in New York City. And just having to leave my apartment was kind of a feat. And I noticed that to leave my apartment, I had to listen to very specific types of music. And I'm a trained musician. And so at the time I was feeling very weak in my visual art skills. And so I decided to sort of lean on my strengths to make something that I needed to hear, instead of listening to what was listening to at the time was just the Tron soundtrack over and over and over again. So the point was to pay attention to the elements in these songs that I particularly felt drawn towards, and make something out of that for myself. So I'm just gonna play an excerpt of the very first hum I ever made, which is called Hums in Keys of G. Actually, that's the wrong hum. So sorry. So I put in, actually, I don't know. That's fine. I'm gonna play an excerpt from I Don't Know, but just to kind of explain what the hums are. So I do focus on keys. So it's hums in the keys of G, because the G chord, G major chord, is a chord that I really, really love. And so in most of my hums, there is a key note. So there, in the hums and keys of G, the G is constant. And then everything else rotates around that key note. And to rotate, I mean, I layer my voice in chords that rotate around that key note. And each notation that I make, or each tone that I make, is one full exhalation. I'll just say that knowing myself, that I made up these rules to just want to make sure that this was also not an anxiety evoking thing. But really quickly, I'm going to stop the share really quickly so I can get the actual tone, so you can at least hear it from my computer. And all right, I'm pretty sure this is the one. So hopefully this will play. I'm going to stop it there, and just sort of say that the hums are different depending on why I'm making them and for what reason. Hums in keys of G was definitely a catharsis. So some of this, some of the dynamics are, they come as I make the piece and as I need them. And one of the other rules is that I never come to a hum with a preconceived idea of what they're going to be. It's just a constant questioning of like, what do I need to hear next? What do I want to hear next? And a lot of the dynamics when it gets louder or softer generally comes as a need. And so of course, this was in response to a lot of frustration. So this is one of the songs that, one of the hums that I use to get out a lot of frustration here. But I also want to share, so sorry if you guys are hearing my computer typing by itself sometimes. So there's like a weird little beep that sounds. I want to play one of the more recent, it's not a hum, but it's something that I made in quarantine for myself. It's not necessarily a sound piece or a hum, but it's sort of how the hums or how I've evolved in making this type of work in following these key notions of making work that's for myself. But this is an excerpt from an actual song called I Don't Know. And I'm so sorry I forget the name of the artist, but it's a song that I was absolutely obsessed with and sang all the time. And again, decided to make it my own. And that's what I'm gonna play for you is pretty much the end of it, where I go from singing the song to improvising the ending in the same vein as I make the hums, just sort of as I needed to and as I wanted to hear it from there on.
I think I broke down into tears. Or every time we dance, I burst into tears.
And so I made that for myself and I play that all the time. I play a lot of my hums just throughout the day. It still serves the purpose of tamping down that anxiety, but also have become things that I just generally enjoy. And so then at the core of that is this idea of just what I want to hear moving forward. So when I started making photographs again, it was still in the same vein of in response to what I needed. These are images that I took just walking around my neighborhood on the left, and on the right hand side are images that I kind of imagined and needed to make, what I often call emotional images. But these images I made in response to just basically coping with a very, I say this all the time, a very acutely traumatic situation. And again, going from this acute traumatic situation, going into photography and just finding a way to ground it in something that I understood and I loved. The photograms in my series are also a response to what I needed, but they're also important in this conversation around abstraction, because I think that I have been approaching abstraction in the way that we will talk about it for some time. But in terms of the work and how I've applied it to the aesthetics, it has evolved as I've developed this way of working instinctually. So these are early photograms. On the left-hand side is an installation of photograms from a series, A Loom of My Own. Mistakes were made in development, and there's number 2 on the top, number 3 on the bottom. On the right-hand side is number 1. And these are 60 inches by 48 inches, so 5 feet by 4 feet in dimension self-portrait photograms. So that's my body. And I'm sharing this, this on the left-hand side is not my photogram. This is a photogram belonging to Kunie Sugiura, who I went to see and visit, well, yeah, I saw her work for the first time when I went to see her lecture at the Penumbra Foundation. And she was sharing a new series of work where she was hand applying the developer. So this image on the left is called, it's from the series of artists and scientists, and it's called After Electric Dress. This is not one of the examples, because I realized that a lot of what we saw during that, that lecture, it's not available online. But what kind of was wonderful about seeing her work, not only being able to see an artist, a photographer working in photograms in this way, realizing that she's also using the grid, but I was kind of shocked at how she actually worked in the darkroom, which was very different from how I worked in the darkroom. I'm very diligent about my concentrations and about timing. But I remember her sharing that she just kind of pours the developer on when she's hand applying, doesn't really pay attention to dilutions. And it was something that really freed me in thinking of another way that I can unlock and let go of an element of control in the darkroom. But it also, as I began working in the darkroom this way, I found that not only could I just kind of just unlock a lot of uncertainty and I would say, I don't want to use the word magic, but there's just there's so much beauty in the uncertainty in the darkroom, in the way that she works. And when I started working that way, I also realized that I got to spend a lot more time with each of the prints. It introduced another element of decision-making as well. Like when am I done with this print? And when do I like this? Do I like what's happening in one section of the print? And do I stop it now, or do I let it go and see what happens later? And I also started asking myself other questions about how I was working in terms of the grid, for instance. So I'm showing on the right-hand side my last photogram, which is number 14 under the series of Loom of My Own, Mistakes Were Made in Development. And you can see that going from number 1 to number 14, I'm also asking myself about formal aspects of the way I work. And so I've been also deviating away or abstracting the grid as well. In 2019, I started working on fabric, and these are 2 early iterations of cyanotypes. The one on the left is in the current show, and I started working on that cyanotype in 2019 as an extension of a residency program that I was doing at the time. And I decided to attempt a self-portrait cyanotype. I had not attempted it before because I just didn't see how it made sense in my ongoing womb series, but this residency gave me a chance to explore that. So I decided to kind of take it on. Both pieces, so on the left and the right, are both on canvas. And I knew how I wanted to work on these. Just in the same vein as I was working in the darkroom with my photograms, I wanted to spend a lot of time with these and selectively develop them over time. But what I realized in doing that the longer I worked on these, the more likely it was that I was not going to see the latent image of my body underneath. So on the left-hand side is not a self-portrait. These are images of crocheted pieces that I used in an exhibition for this residency. But on the right-hand side, it is a self-portrait. And in working, I realized I couldn't get to the latent image underneath. If I wanted to, then I would have to work faster. And I decided to choose time and let go of the expectation of my figurative body and of seeing that. I was not happy about this at first. That also took some time to realize, that what was happening, even though it was not my expectation, that it was something that was also affecting me. And again, it changed the way I approached this work. Another thing that changed the way I approached this work was my own proclivity towards actual abstract painting. On top is a work by Sam Gilliam called Carousel State that he made in 1968, and I first encountered this piece at the Met Breuer in 2018, and we'll talk about this later, but I love abstract expressionism. It was a section of the exhibition that was specifically on abstract expressionism. And they weren't showing any of my favorite pieces, but I saw this on the wall. I'd never, ever seen a Sam Gilliam piece before. And the way it was mounted on the wall, the drape of it was just kind of imprinted on my brain from there. And has affected the way that I see possibilities for fabric. On the bottom is Vivian Suter, who had a show in 2019 at Barbara Gladstone, and this is the show that I saw. On the right-hand side is an installation image of me putting up the first iteration of my installation at the Elizabeth Foundation in November 2020. And I'll say that I really had struggled with how to install these cyanotypes and was installing them even in the midst of not understanding if they were working for me or not, still kind of reconciling with the abstractness in my image, but abstractness, not from me trying to be abstract, but me making a choice with the substrate. And I found Vivian Suter's work on what I'll call a panic stroll through Chelsea in New York, because I was really unclear on how to install this work. And I knew that I didn't want them on the wall. I knew that, but I wanted to suspend them, but unclear about how to suspend them, because I think it's important, for me, it's important that I translate my practice through every element. And I couldn't just hang them up for the sake of hanging them up. But when I walked into that showroom, I experienced this relief, like a wonderful relief that gave me permission to basically just kind of feel out the room. And it also helped me decide on how to use these pieces as a way of creating other restful places in that space. At the time at the Lotus Foundation, and it carries on to my exhibition at the Silver Eye Center, that whenever I install these works, I want them to be in to create restful pockets in the room. And so, yeah, so that's essentially how I got to abstraction. And I'll throw it over to Aaron.
Amazing, Hernease. Yeah, it's interesting. I was trying to make notes and keep up with everything that you're mentioning. I'm trying to sum it up, like to see your level of investigation and experimentation in terms of tangibility and vulnerability through collecting things, going to the performance, the vulnerability of performance through music. And then also back to the tangibility of like fabric and touching material in the dark room, and finding freedom, relinquishing freedom that was not present in the earlier work that was also in the dark room too. So that's amazing. Love seeing that Sam Gilliam piece. It's amazing him as an artist. I think that when you showed was 1968. So 4 or 5 years earlier, he was on stretch canvas just like everybody else.
Yep.
So he made a pretty drastic jump and has kept pace with that. So I just love seeing these artist influences. It's so important. And that's why we're doing this right now. So I just love that.
Yeah.
So my beginnings in abstraction for me. Um, I'm gonna start with the writer and author Nella Larson. Um, her novel Passing is so important to my practice and me as a person. Being an undergrad at University of Memphis, one of the first texts that I was introduced to, and I still think about it to this day, and it impacts me so profoundly. Um, and that's Nella Larson's passing is referring to racial passing, skin tone, skin complexion, and all the implications of that. And this is just from a Western American perspective. There's all kind of other global perspectives on passing, all kind of other implications just within the Americas about passing and racial implications of that as well. But that led me to I was pursuing photojournalism or becoming a photojournalist. I was in school at Ohio University. I had left the Arkansas Delta and the tri-state area of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And then the first thing that was kind of like a culture shock experience for me, but the first thing that I did was ask myself, where are the communities of color? And I stumbled upon something, but I was only aware of it through Nella Larson's passing. So I created this body of work called Isolated Truths, and it was about triracial communities in Southeast Ohio. And you can see the partial full iteration of that on my website. I still need to continue this body of work, but this helped me pursue passing in terms of a written and a visual output. And it intersects with the Underground Railroad in that region as well. Southeast Ohio has a number of Underground Railroad stops, which contributed to the triracial communities that still exist there today and really all over Ohio. But that's a whole other conversation, but it influenced my work like Alchemy, and you'll see that in the next slide. But lastly, on this slide, I want to mention Glenn Ligon, his piece, Study for Passing from 1991. And this piece, like, it combines multiple things. It combines the written and the visual aspect of things, because you got this repetitive pattern that then like dissipates and becomes illegible toward the end of the piece. It's dealing with material. It's also dealing with language. It's dealing with ambiguity. It has sociological and ontological implications about passing, because here we can speculate, like, is Glenn Ligon talking about racial passing, or he could be talking about sociological passing in terms of like gender as well. But one day, if I get to talk to him, I would love to talk to him about this piece, because it's very influential to my pursuit of passing as it relates to abstraction. And then the next slide. Thank you so much, Hernease, for navigating this for me. But in this next slide, that also refers to passing, again, Nella Larson, body of work, Isolated Truths, Glenn Ligon's piece, Passing. Then I come across this Ebony magazine quiz from 1952 as I'm transitioning from being in Ohio, living in Ohio, to pursuing an MFA at Rutgers. This Ebony quiz has cultural influences and cultural implications that deal with the past and the present and the future. But also I'm drawn formally to the grid of this quiz from this magazine layout. And then my response is these middle two images, the formal grid, reacting to faces. One of the things I love about the archive and why I use archival representational images in my work is I'm really drawn to the faces of people. I'm really reacting to the faces and the people in them. And everything that goes along with that. It also deals with tangibility, and then also gaze in that context. So those were like some middle kind of early iterations of what I was doing in Black Alchemy Volume 1. But then that also made me go back to refer back to material, and which I'm thankful to Glenn Ligon and MacArthur Binion, because I would not know about the oil stick, and the application of the oil stick as a material to talk about identity through abstraction without Glenn Ligon and MacArthur Binion's work. So this is a painting, and I like to talk about this from the perspective of the freedom to choose through those two artists that I just mentioned. And then the dot patterns that you see at the top is Braille. So the Braille talks about access. There's particular words that I'm writing and repeating, thinking back to the grid and things like that. Things being laid out in patterns. So how I'm trying to navigate through my use of abstraction, especially in Black Alchemy Volume 1, I'm dealing with those same things that artists dealt with that came before me. Language, formal qualities, but also the freedom to talk about these complex issues through abstraction. And I'll talk about that more, like how I think abstraction is the perfect medium for these kind of conversations. And so next slide, I'm going to talk about kind of like my background. Like these are early things and theories and things that I came across as I went further down the rabbit hole of abstraction. So Black artists who were abstractionists toward the 1960s and 80s were viewed as outsiders because their work was perceived to not be politically or socially engaged. And that is coming all the way back from 1925, when Alain Locke, in his book, The New Negro, argued that the primary responsibility and function of the artist is to express his own individuality, and in doing that, to communicate something universal, some universal human appeal. But then you jump to 1926, you have a conflicting viewpoint or opposing viewpoint from Langston Hughes, from this essay titled The Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain. And I'll just read like that first little paragraph that you see up there. And Langston Hughes writes, "One of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, 'I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet,' meaning I believe I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that I would like to be white." And I was sorry that the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. And I doubted then that with his desire to run away spiritually from his race, this boy would ever be a great poet. But this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race toward whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. The Black arts movement, and then how that correlates with the Black arts movement, it radically opposed any concept of the artist that alienates him from his community. Black art is the aesthetic and the spiritual sister of the Black power movement concept at that time, and as such envisions that art speaks to directly the needs and aspirations of Black America. So I give all that background information to jump back to 1971, where Frank Bowling writes this essay titled "It's Not Enough to Say Black is Beautiful." And it's so much going on between the year of 1970 and 1971 as it relates to Black abstract art. I'm still finding out so much. I mean, there was so much going on, and really the meat of it is there. But 1971, abstractions emerge in the space of Black art, and that undermined the cultural representation of Black art. It started the presentation of the freedom from representation. It also talked about the viewer and what the artist trust or implications that they had in control over the viewer, because they looked at a work of art and didn't necessarily see a Black figure, or didn't even implicate that it was made by a Black artist. Also, these artists trusted in modernist traditions. Also, the vulnerability to the times, all those things referring to the Black arts movement, in which they were making all this work. So I encourage everyone to go look at that 1971 essay by Frank Bowling, because he really breaks down a lot of things that were happening at that time. And that's always a place I like to work backwards and forwards from. And I have two more slides. In this next slide, after absorbing all that stuff, this is when I first kind of have an ebb and flow between representational and non-representational images as a photographer. So I don't arrive at abstraction without that idea of passing. And then also this idea about perception and stripping away all things political. And then also how interests and investigations reveal or continue over time. So with that, I'm speaking about post-reflections, thinking about the post-minimalist movement, and everything like that, geometric abstraction, and Black artists that found themselves within that canon, as an artist in 2015. And then I'm still thinking about post-reflections as an idea, or as a idea to work through abstraction within my own practice, all the way in 2020. And then this last slide, I believe is the last one. Yeah, the last slide for me in terms of the beginnings of abstraction. I wanted to touch back again on artist influences. This one on the left is from Adrian Piper's show that was at MoMA, that big retrospective, one of the largest ones at MoMA to that date. I think it was like 300 works in there from that artist, Adrian Piper. But on the left, Adrian Piper is evidence of Adrian Piper's investigation with minimalism. You know, minimalism can be filtered through abstraction, or you can come to abstraction through minimalism, or vice versa. You don't get one without the other. But Adrian Piper's wall sculpture, and making those from an influence of seeing Saul LeWitt's work. And so I believe these were made in 1967, and then in 1968, Saul LeWitt and Adrian Piper began a friendship, and it goes from there. I also think it's important to note that in history, artists know one another, and artists collaborate with one another, and are just in conversation with one another. But I want to read this little excerpt from MacArthur Binion's. This was a piece that he had in art form, but he says, "All my work is autobiographical in a way. Growing up, we lived in a 2-bedroom house, and I was one of 11 children. There was always noise, never any space for yourself. I don't listen to anything when I'm trying to work. As a Black man, there's this assumption: Black man, abstraction, jazz. Okay, fine. The thing is, what's wrong with that formula for me is that I'm not influenced by jazz. I come from the same place as jazz." An earlier body of work that canvases that is called, I called DNA Studies, incorporated pages from my address book, all those names and numbers I've had in one book for over 20 years. When I was working on those, I was reliving every day of my life. Every name, every face, it's emotional. You think of things and you feel things. I was fortunate to be able to leave New York after 20 years here, an environment where making work has become quite difficult. I've been in Chicago since 1992, and in that same studio for 12 years, I have had a rigorous work schedule. I want a certain emotional rawness with discipline, give it structure, and give structure to my day. I haven't been in therapy in decades. These days, my therapy is the paint wall. Anything I need to solve, I solve while I'm working. So I just love those words by MacArthur Bingen, and it kind of gives you an insight into the abstractions and the grids that he creates and has been making since that same time period of 1971 as well. And it's just a bunch of implications I can go into from that, but I'll stop talking so we can move to the next section. Thank you, Hernease.
You're welcome. It's okay. Because our next section, we're going to talk about our works. So I'll start off by going through some installation images from my current show, Recapitulation. And then Aaron will go through Black Alchemy, if this one thing is true. And I'll also say that I wrote down a lot of notes. Like there's, yeah, because so I'll let everyone know that Aaron and I have been, I think we've talked for a total of, I don't know, countless hours, just countless hours. And every time we talk there's more that comes up. For instance, I went to that Adrian Piper show as well, didn't make it all the way through, but she's another artist who greatly has influenced me as well. So I love that in our talks that there are certain things that we've kept from each other. Or there's just that much more to go through. But I'll move on so I don't, take up more of our time. But this is an installation image of one vantage point of the show here. So as I said before, when I'm installing these works, typically the cyanotypes, I suspend them from the ceiling. And the more I work with them, and this is only the second time that I've worked in this way with these amount of pieces, I'll say, I'm creating a space that is site specific. And David and Kate were gracious enough to give me 3 days to feel out the space, because I've learned that is how I work best with these works. So you'll see that on the walls are cyanotype pieces, photogram pieces that I have crocheted into. And they are from a sub-series of my Loom series called Bear With Me Foundation, and number 17 is on the left, and number 16 is on the right. Number 17 is a combination of cyanotype. So that blue is cyanotype that I've treated the yarn with. And what I do with these, I crochet into them in light safe, or I would say in the dark, in darkroom safe lighting. And what has started to happen, and this isn't with all the pieces, but in talking about improvisation and bringing up even jazz here, I'm improvising these crochet stitches. And again, this has just sort of come from how I've worked with these pieces, what I enjoy doing. And it's sort of like figuring out and solving the issue of how to get from left to right, or just what do I want to see on these surfaces. And I also crochet into the ceiling. So there's spin it using crochet, but also crochet improvisationally in whatever space that I want to. Essentially, I just kind of use this room to do whatever I want with these pieces. And I make these spaces for myself first, spaces where I feel safe and where I feel ready and done. And this is just from a vantage point where you're looking up, if you can see, just certain overlapping crochet pieces there. And I also want to show a video that I think video is probably the best way to see or to experience this work. And it also has the audio piece, so you'll hear some audio as well. So hopefully that'll come through. Right now that I'm wearing in this video, but we'll get into this later. I work on different types of fabric, and that's also a part of exploring this this medium, to see how it behaves on different opacities. We'll talk about opacity later. Different opacities, different transparencies, and different fabrics, and it's part of expanding this process, and just kind of getting to know it, and also getting used to just simply enjoying how something looks. So again, these are all self-portraits. So I'm in there somewhere. And so then working in my studio, and with the memory that I have of what I look like laying on top of these pieces. And just again, to iterate for those who don't know what a cyanotype is. So a photogram is a contact print made on a photosensitive surface. A cyanotype is specifically UV or sun activated. So you could use an artificial source of light, or the sun. And for me, I use the sun. So for all these pieces, I laid outside on them for at least 20 minutes for exposure. And then I developed them selectively in the studio. So a lot of them, so most of them, my body is there somewhere, but because of the process, that underlying image has been abstracted. All right. On to you, Aaron.
Amazing. I love that moment where you arrive at the crocheting into the print. That's such an evolution, even from the other moment that you arrive at with the photograms, and at the scale and how they were produced. So I just love that, how you arrive at that is amazing. So these with Black Alchemy, if there's one thing is true, I just want to start off by saying these photographs were inspired by the philosopher and writer Charles W. Mills, who unfortunately passed away I think last month or within the last few weeks. So I remember emailing him as I put this book together to say to use a portion of an essay, White Being, Black Being, Metaphysics of Race, which is from One True Thing, Meditations on Black Aesthetic, by Kerr James Marshall. So I found that this essay in that catalog, and it greatly influenced me on how to use abstraction to make sense of chaos, of everything that has been going on, especially toward the beginning of the pandemic, with all the different social movements and protests going on, and different just things that it just seems like it's been never ending. So how do I deal with relevant topics in the studio through abstraction? So I just wanted to mention that Charles Mills' influence and impact on myself as an artist, but also thinking about formal qualities and how they intersect with complex histories is another reason I use abstraction. On the right, you see Pauli Murray. If you don't know who Pauli Murray is, very influential on some on the Brown versus Board of Education case in this country. And there's a whole documentary about Pauli Murray on Amazon Prime. But Pauli Murray wrote a paper about Plessy versus Ferguson, and that's how that impacts the Brown versus Board of Education case. Also, Pauli Murray's story intersects Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, you did another major American court case that deals directly with passing. And then Pauli Murray herself intersects gender and racial passing. And that comes from family background and other things, but I won't spend too much time on that. But these intersections and histories that I'm interested in they just intersect constantly, and it goes all the way back to that Nella Larson book. But also African Americans in the military, again, faces and gaze located in the archive, representational and non-representational ways of seeing within abstraction. Also, the effect that abstraction has on Black representational space, and how that addresses the integrity of abstraction as well. And specifically, this image spoke to me, Tuskegee Airmen, and how African-American soldiers were treated when they came home from World War II, the Double V campaign, and how that was a catalyst for the civil rights movement. So we don't get to where we get to in certain places in history, present day, without these past histories. So I think it's important for me for this to end up in my work and through abstraction, because we need to be constantly reminded of them and reevaluate them for the times that we find ourselves in. And then in the next slide, I'm jumping to metaphor and perception and material, making what would be considered fully abstract images, and just on the surface devoid of political implications, if you will. One of the things I write in the notes here is, would you ask yourself, did a Black artist make this? What does that question say about capacity and opacity, or ambiguity? What does that say about art history and the expectations of the capacity of people to make things? And then in the last slide, from Black Alchemy, if this one thing is true, I'm returning to looking at the self and archive as well. I'm using my own archive as well as historical archives, and I'm looking at historical legacies. In this image, I'm thinking about, again, the opposing philosophies of Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois, the talented tent versus African Americans' pursuit of trades as a way of life. And then also I'm exploring a speculative space as it relates to the title. Where do I point the viewer to the histories? Somebody may not know that is Booker T. Washington. The aesthetics, the shapes, the depth, the projection, how light is absorbed, how light is reflected, and then also how that creates recognizable forms. So these are all the things that I'm thinking about in terms of abstraction, as it relates to some of the things that I'm considering, and if this one thing is true. And there's a lot more, but it would take too much time to talk about all of it. But yeah, I get really excited about this work, and excited about the book as well. So that's it for me, Hernease. We can move to that last section.
All right. Yeah, because I also was just sort of thinking maybe we'll be able to get to that.
Yeah.
I did end up watching the documentary with Polly Murray, and I've been thinking a lot about. So let's get into our last section here is called Notions of Freedom. Opacity, edges, and double consciousness. And these are what we kind of whittled down from our talks with one another that we thought we could kind of get into. And one of the things that I really, really enjoy about Aaron is that every time we talk, there's like a slew of readings and references that he sends, and they've been very eye-opening. And so we did like a passing back and forth, but the only thing I really sent to Aaron was this essay that I've been kind of going over and over in terms of my practice. It's called For Opacity, from the book Poetics of Relations by Edouard Glissant. And one of the many essays and articles that Aaron sent me was The Method of Freedom, Abstraction, the Work of Adam Pendleton, by Stephen Squibb, which goes over kind of at the core of it, talking about Adam Pendleton's work at the 2015 Venice Biennale, we had, I would say, like a really rich conversation around how these two are kind of talking with one another, and the relationships between these two essays in particular. So this last part, we're kind of just gonna continue our conversation, many hours of conversation around why these pieces are important to us, and how we think that they relate, particularly in these ideas around abstraction and freedom, in particular, freedom and abstraction. Aaron, you wanna start? Do you have a working question?
Let me see. I'm looking at my notes and I always like to read. Let me just read this aloud, because I think that always helps, especially via Zoom. You know, that relieves the burden of the participants that are here with us, and I just love to read out loud. It's a way to perform. It's a form of performance, so I love that. But I think these two parts that I picked out were like, right, like I think when we hear the word abstraction, you know, it's a consensus. It's like, you know, non-representational. But then there's various definitions of that, depending on what history you come across and whatever your lived experience is. So I just want to read this. What is meant by abstraction is this context. Abstract art is often understood to be non-figurative. It is not intended to resemble something else located outside the frame. This refusal of mimesis highlights the role of imagination in the process of creation. If art does not seek to reproduce or represent something already experienced, then the imagination must become the source of inspiration. Abstraction is what remains of something. And I know abstraction is what remains. I know you got excited about that during our hours of conversation. So we can talk about that from that space. But then in his next section in the article, it talks about if nothing could be more pressing today. So again, past, present, future, coming back to the future, or coming back to the present from the past. So if nothing could be more pressing today than the recovery of abstraction as a method of freedom, it is precisely because only abstract work can bring together the conflicting movements of a concept like independence within a common frame. This capacity is the first step towards understanding the world in which we find ourselves, which is itself the first step towards reducing suffering. For those institutions that have relied on suffering for their own profitable existence, there is this vested interest in restricting who has access to this capacity for abstraction. All right, I was talking about capacity earlier. Pendleton's work demonstrates how this restriction relies on the production of Blackness as a kind of incapacity to think beyond appearances. So I think for me, when I read that, it just summarized all my thoughts about freedom within abstraction, that 1971, it's not enough to say Black is beautiful, Alain Locke, Langston Hughes, and a bunch of other stuff that we haven't even mentioned yet. Yeah.
And I'll say that it's one of those things, well, in that question that you asked, and you've said that about my work too, and I think that's also how you approach just work in general. Well, because I think one of the things that I really admire about your work in abstraction is because it really does challenge my own ideas of what abstraction can look like or how other people are using it. Also, again, coming from my point of view, that I think I love abstraction is what remains of something. And also the earlier sentence of just how if art does not seek to reproduce or represent something already experienced, then imagination must become the source of inspiration, of just how individual that is. And going down to this statement of Pendleton's work being a demonstration how the restriction relies on the production of Blackness as a kind of incapacity to think beyond appearances, where that whole idea of like, does it look Black? Does it look like it was made by a Black artist? Within abstraction, for instance, and I've shared this with you, I'll share with everyone, when I first encountered Sam Gilliam's work, I didn't know he was Black. And I didn't really have, I don't know if I think about that when I look at art, if I think about whether or not the person is Black or not, especially when it comes to painting. Being a photographer, it's something that I feel the least experienced or the least qualified to even think beyond what I just see. And in particular with painting, it mostly is whatever I feel, which is why I love abstract expressionism, because it evokes feelings from me that I don't really understand. And so then, so that individuality that kind of transcends and kind of whittles it down to your own individual experience is what I feel is that capacity for abstraction. But when you think of work, or what I would say more commonly esteemed Black, and even talking about how we've talked about passing artists who have very complicated experiences in the art world. So we've mentioned Howardina Pindell and Jack Whitten, who are abstract artists that we both love. How, in a sense, that they were told that they are incapable of having this capacity for abstraction, which is false. The reality is the market, whiteness, just a general culture deems them as incapable of having this capacity for something that they're already doing, which is being an individual who are also talking about social issues, but using this form of abstraction to express themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned Howardina Pindell. I should have had those articles ready to like paste in the chat for people. But yeah, I mean, Howardina Pindell is one of the artists that I researched in the last few years, and you come across these very bold and unapologetic accounts of like how people encountered her work as an artist, working in abstraction in the 1970s, based on how she looked. Taking her work this place to a space that should to the Studio Museum in Harlem, recounting that the director at that time told her to go downtown and show it the white boys. And then you do that, and then they tell you don't belong there either. And then her counterparts at that time, Al Loving and William T. Williams, always say artists know one another and always are talking to one another. And they're saying, hey, I'm having the same experience. And there's so much that happened in 1970 and 1971 around Black artists working in abstraction. So within my own work, I'm always trying to recall that history and think about that history and note that history, because a lot of those artists are still working today. They're our contemporaries working. So I believe that I don't exist as an abstract artist without them, and their resilience to not stop making the work based off those encounters that they had. But Howardina Pindell's accounts that she was met with in those early years were it may be jarring, could describe as jarring for some people, but that is the evidence that supports the hypothesis, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
And kind of why I work from that space. Fully abstract, referencing black representation, non-representation, challenging what the aesthetic should be, because these artists have already been doing it. And I'm trying to work from a speculative standpoint, which Adam Pillington is a good example of that. Coming from Dada, the Dada movement, and also taking parts from the Black arts movement from Amir Baraka's poem, which includes the words Black Dada, and then arriving at this question of what can Dada do for me? Hence his manifesto, Black Dada. But yeah.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
nihilism. Yeah, and then there's Glissant, and these highlights. These are Aaron's highlights, which I really loved. Where I think the yellow is you.
Well, yeah. Well, the yellow
the
is
red
like,
is me.
Yeah, the red is like, they made me think about your work. They made me think about your perspective as an artist, materially and theoretically. And then the yellow is just like, I just thought those were like, they kind of get into that conversation about what Glissant is talking about in terms of opacity. And then I like, how that relates back to freedom and abstraction in this other article or essay.
Yeah, I kind of want to read the middle part out loud.
Yeah, go ahead.
That starts as far as my, so it goes, as far as my identity is concerned, I will take care of it myself. That is, I shall not allow it to become cornered in any essence. I shall also pay attention to not mixing it into any amalgam. Rather, it does not disturb me to accept that there are places where my identity is obscure to me. And the fact that it amazes me does not mean I relinquish it. Human behaviors are fractal in nature. If we become conscious of this and give up trying to reduce such behaviors to the obviousness of a transparency, this will perhaps contribute to lightening their load, as every individual begins not grasping his own motivations, taking himself apart in this manner. And so I'm going to credit the artist. His name is Kevin Briscoe, who's not on this call, but maybe someone knows him. But the reason why I've been reading this is because I had a previous show in Brooklyn at Established Gallery, and the title of the show was "One Day, I'll Share." And he came in and was like, "What is up with this title? You're sharing, but obviously there's something that you're keeping away from us. Have you read On or For Opacity by Glissant?" And I was so mad because someone had recommended that I read this years prior, and I wrote it down and didn't read it until he came into the show and reminded me of that. And so we had a long conversation around this because he was also dealing with questions around opacity in his own work. But upon reading this, this is kind of, it feels like a manifesto. It's a plea for what I would, and I'm still going through this, and I'm listening to analysis of this essay because it's undoing a lot of, or I should say it's explaining a lot of the things that that I am going through in terms of my work, but also how I approach myself in the work. So in this space, Kate at Silver Eye has written the wall text, and a lot of it is about our conversation around this essay where I was just like, I don't know. Like, so that whole point where it says, rather it does not disturb me to accept that there are places where my identity is obscure to me, because I'm going through a transition in my life in terms of my own psychological healing from things. There are things that are unfurling and that are becoming apparent to me, and I'm learning all the time that there are things in my unconscious. There's a lot of stuff in there, and and Glissant uses the word opacity and transparency to mirror psych terms, so psychoanalytic, psychological terms. So we could kind of see opacity as being also the unconscious or the subconscious in a way. But I love these terms because of how they apply visually. And then also in particular, how we're able to apply them in photography as well. But also mostly that part where we can be unknown to ourselves, and we also have the right to be opaque with each other, but how opaque we are doesn't mean that we can't relate. That a part of relating to one another is an understanding that there are parts of you that I will never understand, because there are parts of you that you won't understand. And so there's this mutual respect and also an awareness of sort of our like inherent inabilities that is not necessarily a weakness. To me, it's incredibly fascinating, and sometimes hurtful, sometimes comforting. But it also, again, he says like human behaviors are fractal in nature. And it's a part of something that I think I've been pleading for my whole life, is to be fractal and to be understood as a 4-dimensional being. And so generalizations really bother me. The need to collapse people into categories really bothers me, because it is something that has been something that I've been fighting against for a very long time. And so, but what I love about how you see abstraction, and also talking about, these artists that we love, they knew, a lot of them knew each other, interacted in real time, and especially, I'm based in New York, have had like, there's still like artist communities happening everywhere. My practice is very insular. It's a very internal one where my challenge is to translate it for other people. But for you, it is a start of conversations where you want to interact and have conversations that I think call to our differences, but using this, the freedom of abstraction as a tool for that, to make room for this fractal nature that I think Lisan talks about.
Yeah, absolutely. And to sum up my what you were referring to from my perspective is like, I guess what freedom and abstraction means to me is kind of like being able to contribute to this historical canon, or just exist as an artist to contribute to things formally, like in a legitimate way, that has nothing to do with your identity. And I think a lot of that work from the 1970s, those artists are doing that. But since it was a space they had nothing to do with setting up the rules for, they were met with all these historical biases. So then we have to talk about them. And I think your individual perspective and experiences that you were just referring to, I think that is the universal space to enter into, because all of us as individuals deal with those things. Some of us happen to be artists, some of us happen to be musicians, some of us happen to, whatever the case may be, and those things come out, and whatever we touch, tangible, and we share with others. So that's that speculative aesthetic space of a universal or utopian conversation that I always like have in the back of my head. And then I think that relates to, like identity and abstraction, that whole double consciousness from W. Du Bois, constantly looking at oneself through the eyes of others, from just multiple planes. It's just never ending, it seems. Just so many perspectives and options you can come from. But that also allows you, again, that's the perfect space for that is abstraction, I believe, to deal with all those challenges. And then also edges, how people enter your work. Hernease, you mentioned the term, the edges cannot be smooth out. They cannot be smooth edges. Yes. And I was like, do you mean they have to be sharp edges? And then you broke that down. So I would love to hear you talk about the edges.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a part of just holding on to who you are and so I think I was thinking about that in terms of how, like, our differences in sort of like the end point of the work. Not saying that that's like the finale or the final point, but just sort of the journey or the trajectory of it, because it's something that I think I actively try not to do, is to think about those who I will be in contact with. It's just a hope. Like I'm just like, I hope people are able to enter into this. I'm not going to do what I used to do and try to dictate the conversation, try to say something from the very beginning. So the hope is from this very solo time with myself that it connects with whoever it connects with. And it's connected with people who are connecting with the work in a very different way. And I kind of enjoy people like, oh, is your work about this? Because this is what I'm feeling. This, and that. Is it that? And I just go, no. But I'm so glad that that's something you've come away with. That's totally fine. I don't see that as being a failure, and I don't want people to conform. So that's when I talk about the sharp edges. It's just essentially just holding on to who you are. And also because I'm holding on to who I am as much as I can when I'm making the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important stance to have, very important perspective to work from, because I think as artists, we all need some version of that, especially when when our work enters institutional spaces. I think that's so important for narrative sake, contextual sake, all those things are important. So I just love that perspective. I appreciate you sharing that perspective. I think that also
no, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that also, like, we can get into the conversations of things being a monolith. And what I was talking about earlier about how the integrity of the abstraction puts on the Black representational space and all that good stuff. But yeah, you go ahead.
No, because I think I just want to sort of emphasize that what you're doing is it just feels very vulnerable to me in a different way, to have those conversations and still or to even seek out those conversations in general. But yeah, that's all I want to add to that.
Yeah, I love that conversation of vulnerability, and this is we can end it right here and take questions from the audience. I'm so excited to talk with them, but take questions. But the topic of vulnerability, every artist has to deal with vulnerability. But one of the things that I love and why Kerry James Marshall
Tara, your phone's Tara, your sound is on.
Hey Tara.
I don't know. Hi Tara.
But one of the last thing I'll say about vulnerability as an artist is I love Kerry James Marshall's perspective on it in terms of when you enter the space, just the space of choosing to be an artist, and then the different parameters that are set up that we move through as artists. For instance, I'll use the example, if you enter the space with a curator, for example, one of the ways to challenge or to work against being in a vulnerable space is knowing as much as that curator does and having something to say about it. And that's why I engage with all these different histories. I just love reading about artist interactions. I love reading about artists' perspectives, and I love just figuring out what was happening back then, who was saying what was their perspective. And then from that, I like to have my own opinion. So then that's another angle to talk about vulnerability. So I love this question about vulnerability and the challenge abstraction presents for that. So yeah, I love that. Thank you for bringing it up, Hernease. I love that. Yeah.
It's like another 2 hours and we can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody.
Are there any questions? Yeah. Oh yeah, thank you all. If there are any questions, or I know we have about 5 minutes, or I don't know how we're doing on time, David. Should I stop my share?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes if anyone has any questions. It was it was just such an amazing conversation. And like you were saying, you were taking notes, Aaron. I'm like, you could fill a couple of notepads over here. So much to think about and such beautiful work, and just really grateful to have this insight into your ways of thinking and your histories of influence that is just super special, and we don't always have time to dig into. So just really phenomenal conversation, and I'm glad I recorded it because I know there's already parts I want to go back to and things that I want to write down and read and explore. It's just so rich.
Great. Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, I'll stay silent just in case anyone else wants to say something.
And I also wanted to say thank you, everyone, so much for coming and tuning in and for being a part of this. I know, really glad to have you here in the Zoom space.
Hi, Sarah.
Just wanted to thank you both. I mean, I don't really have a particular question, but I was just really excited about the different histories and theories that you've brought in. I found it super enlightening, and I can't wait to see your show. Hernease, I haven't seen it in person yet, and I'm really looking forward to it now. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so good to see you guys. I haven't seen Sarah and Jen in a really long time. They're friends from, from New York, who are now in Pittsburgh. But yeah.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you all so much for coming, and
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you, Aaron and Hernease. And
yeah, thank you, David and Kate, for even suggesting this. Yeah, because gosh, there was something else I was going to say about this. I can't remember, but oh yeah, maybe for instance, talking about like, community and communication and artists knowing each other. Like I've been meaning to reach out to Aaron for a long time. So when you guys are just like, we think you guys should talk, I'm just like, oh yeah, no, of course. Oh yeah, no, this is the push that I needed. So
well, like I said, we'll be sending out Aaron's book soon for those who bought one, and we have extra copies too. And you have until Saturday if you're in Pittsburgh to see Hernease's installation. So this is the last weekend, so make sure you get here if you're in town, or come to town and see it. It's worth the trip.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Hernease. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. So great to see
Bye,
people's
everyone.
names
Thank you.
and sometimes faces.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.
Bye.